Quadratic formula, so we have ax squared plus bx plus c. With the quadratic formula, it's really, really important that you remember that a is the number in front of x squared, not including x squared, just the number in front. B is the number in front of x, and c is that constant, and it always has to equal 0 for this to work. And so the quadratic formula is as follows: x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This is something you need to memorize, and you can guarantee tomorrow I'll show you some great YouTube videos that you've probably seen, but you can see again. And so what the purpose of the quadratic formula is if you can't solve by using double bubble or complete the square, quadratic formula will work every single time. Every single time. There's not a time the quadratic formula will not work. So typically, since people tend not to like complete the square, typically people go straight for double bubble, and then after that they go to quadratic formula. So here's a problem. I have x squared plus 2x minus 15. So I'm going to show you how to solve this all three ways and show you that all three ways will get you the same exact thing. So here we have x squared plus 2x minus 15. Now if you were to use the box to solve this, you would get x and x in the beginning of the box, and then you would get a positive 5 and a negative 3. And so to solve, to finish off, I need to take each one, set it equal to 0. And when I do that, I've got x equals negative 5 and x equals 3. So those are my two solutions using double bubble. Complete the square, which we've just finished working on a little bit, goes as follows. So I build my square up. I got my x squared in there, that's x and x. I've got my 2x, those both go there, so that gives me a 1 and 1. Remember, it equals, we moved that 15 over, so it equals 15 now. And then now it's time to complete the square. So 1 times 1 gives me 1, so I have to add 1 to the other side also. Remember, what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. And then continuing on, I got my x minus 1 twice, so x minus 1 squared equals 16. Square root both sides. So square root and squared cancel. X minus 1 equals plus or minus 4. Add 1 to both sides. So now x equals 1 plus or minus 4, which is 1 plus 4 is 5, and 1 minus 4 is negative 3. We got the same answer, just different method. And now solving by the quadratic formula. So here we go. Quadratic formula, x equals negative b. If you remember, b was 2. Oh, let's remember the actual equation. What was it? What was it? Where is it? X squared plus 2x minus 15. X squared plus 2x minus 15. All right, so let's go back. Okay, quadratic formula. X equals negative 2, negative b, plus or minus the square root. We're going to have a lot under there, so we leave a big spot. Square root of b squared. So we've got 2 squared minus 4 times a. In this case, a is 1. Remember, a is in front of x squared, times c, which is negative 15, all over 2 times a, which is 1. So we have negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 plus 60 all over 2 equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 64 all over 2. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 64 is 8 over 2. So we have negative 2 plus 8 divided by 2, and we have negative 2 minus 8 divided by 2. Remember, that plus or minus sign is just saying you're splitting up to a positive and a negative. So we have two problems now. Here's where we get our two answers. Negative 2 plus 8 is 6. Divided by 2 is 3. We've got a problem here. Why do I have... negative b plus or minus. I'm supposed to get negative 3 and a positive 5. Oh, I know I'm not. It's supposed to be a negative 5 and a positive 3. I made a mistake here, didn't I? Okay, so right here, I put that my bubble was x minus 1, but it's supposed to be x plus 1, so that was a big mistake there. So then I would subtract 1, so I'd have a negative 1 plus 4, it would be negative 5 and positive 3. Shoot. Why didn't anybody tell me I did that? All right, so I was right here. So it is positive 3 and negative 5. Oh, too tiny, too tiny. Let's make this bigger. So now it's just a matter of practicing. So you can probably speed through this if you're good. You should, however, pause it, do the problem yourself, and then see what I get. So the first things first is this has to equal 0. So I'm going to subtract 35 from both sides. Has to equal 0. So we have 3x squared plus 8x minus 35 equals 0. And now I can use the quadratic formula. So we have x equals negative b, which is 8, plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times a is 3, c is negative 35-ish, all over 2 times 3. All right, now it's just a matter of simplifying this. One of our first things to do is get that square root, so it's just one number. So I've got 64 plus, hold on, I gotta go get my calculator. Okay, 4 times 3 times 35 is 420 all over 6. So we have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 420 plus 64 is 484 all over 6. Now if I try to square root 484, I get 22. Awesome. So now I have negative 8 plus or minus 22 over 6. So we split this up into the plus and the minus. 8 plus 22 over 6 and negative 8 minus 22 over 6. So then let's see here. A negative 8 plus 22 would be 14 over 6, which reduces to 7/3. And then negative 8 minus 22 is negative 30 over 6, which is negative 5. So my two answers are 7/3 and negative 5. Next problem, once again, I want to get it so that it's just 0 equals. So I'm going to move the 12x over and add 5 to both sides. So we've got 0 equals 2x squared minus 12x plus 18. So now I use my formula, x equals negative, well that's going to be a plus 12 because it was a negative 12, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So negative 12 squared, negative b squared minus 4 times a is 2 times c is 18, all over 2 times a is 2. So we get 12 plus or minus the square root of 144 minus 4 times 2 times 18 is 144. Ooh, I like this one. All over 4. So we've got 12 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 4. Now the square root of 0, people, is 0. So this is an interesting one because 12 plus 0 and 12 minus 0 are exact same things. 12 plus 0 and 12 minus 0. So we get 12 over 4 for both of them, which would be 3. And so technically I get 3, just 3. I know I got it twice, but really I have one answer, 3. Why? Because of that guy right there. That 0 right there, adding or subtracting, it doesn't matter, it doesn't change anything. And we're going to talk about that more later. All right, one more here. So, let's change color. Let's move the 2 over. So we have negative x squared plus 2x minus 2 equals 0. So x equals negative 2, right, because b is 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared, minus 4 times a is negative 1, and c is negative 2, all over 2 times a is negative 1. So we get negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 8. So all those negatives make a minus, then 4 times 1 times 2 is 8, all over negative 2. So we get negative 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 all over negative 2. Negative 2 plus or minus, well, square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of negative is I, all over negative 2. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to reduce, because they can all be divided by 2. And you can only do this if they can all be divided by 2. So let's divide by -2 just to get rid of that negative on the bottom. So -2 goes into -2 once. -2 goes into 2, -1 time. And -2 goes into -2 once. So we have 1 plus or minus -1i over 1. Now, by the way, I'm going to point out this negative right there, and then these guys, it's just going to change it to a plus or minus still. So we're just going to write our answer as 1 plus or minus 1i. Or you could say 1 plus or minus I. So yes, sometimes you're going to get I, and this is where you're going to find it, is when you're doing the quadratic formula. So the last thing I want to talk about here is the discriminant. Now, this is a big word, discriminant, and basically it's describing a part of the quadratic formula. So let's just remember the quadratic formula. It was x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now the discriminant is the part of the square root business. Okay? Because here's the big deal. Square rooting can make a big deal, right? If you square root a regular number like 36, you're going to have two answers. You're going to have plus 36 because of that positive right there, and then you have a minus 6 because of that negative. But if what's in here is 0, remember when that happened? When we had 0, we had just one answer, because if we added 0 and subtracted 0, we got the same thing. And if what's in here is negative, then we're going to be square rooting a negative, so we're going to get I. And technically, if you get I as an answer, there are no real zeros, because remember, I isn't real, it's imaginary. So if you got I, then there are no real zeros. Even though you got an answer, there's no real zeros. And so what's inside of here is really a big deal. So let's just recap that. If you have a positive inside the square root, so we're talking about if inside of there is positive, you're going to have two real zeros, two real answers. If what's inside is 0 itself, then you're only going to have one real answer, or real 0. Let me put 0 there. And if it's negative inside of there, you're going to have no real zeros. So let's look here. For this, I'm just going to look at the discriminant, because I'm just figuring out what are, or how many zeros am I going to have. So I have negative, okay, b squared, so it's negative 6 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times 10, which is, or c, which is 10. Okay, so that gives me a square root of 36 minus 40. So we have the square root of negative 4, which is 2i. So there are no real zeros. I don't have to do any other work, because the only thing I'm answering right now is that there's no real zeros. I'm not answering what are the zeros, I'm just figuring out how many are there. And so now the question you should be kind of asking yourself is, what does this picture look like? See, that was a quadratic up there. This is a quadratic, and so it's going to graph a parabola. So we're wondering, what does this look like then if it doesn't have zeros? Because remember, the whole point of zeros is, where does it cross the x-axis, right? If it had two real zeros, it would be a parabola, open up or down, I don't know, but open up or down, and it would cross 1, 2 places. That's why we kept getting two answers, because it's crossing the x-axis in 2 places. Okay, if we had one real zero, well then our parabola is just hitting it at one spot. Okay, right at the vertex, it's just hitting at one spot. That's one real zero. So then what does no real zeros look like? Well, that's a parabola, open up or down, I don't know, that does not hit the x-axis. So maybe it's up here and it never actually makes it down to the x-axis. Or if you had one facing down, it'd be down here and it would never actually hit the x-axis. And so that's what it looks like when it doesn't have any real zeros. And if you did the quadratic formula, you would get I. So that's it for the lesson. By the way, I want to point out, I figured out what all that tapping was. Right now, I could either hit stop and then save it, or what I've been doing lately is I've just been hitting save right away, and I started typing in the name I'm going to save it as. And so what you're hearing is my typing, because it's technically not done recording.